All right, welcome to another IAEI News Live. My name is Thomas Dimitrovich. Today, we're going to dig into a topic that I've recently received some questions about. We're going to talk surge protective devices and the NEC and surge protection. And it all starts now. Okay, welcome back. So, Surge has seen, considerable amount of change over the last few cycles. I'm going to want you to get open, and this is a recorded session. So I just want to let you know up front, and I know I forget sometimes, but this is a recorded session. I am probably in the air right now, so going somewhere. So in any case, I'm going to ask you to bring up NFPA. What I like about NFPA Link is I can go to past editions of the code. We're going to talk NEC 2023. So hopefully you have a copy of either the hard copy of 2023 code or NFPA Link, one of the two. You're not going to get a PDF anymore of these documents, so no more Adobe Acrobat files. That is a thing of the past. We are in the world of NFPA Link, which is honestly, when I first my first introduction to it, and it was before I even used it, I didn't like it. I'm a book person, so I like the book, and I do like the PDF because I like the search. But I'll tell you what, NFPA Link search is like no other experience, because you can search many different documents. You can search the entire National Electrical Code, just one article, or just one chapter. There's a lot of different capabilities. So I'm going to stick with NFPA Link. You may see me open this book, but you know what I'm missing right now are my spectacles. I do have an emergency set. I got one of these. I don't know if you've ever had these before, but I keep these in my phone just for my Ben Franklin days, just for emergencies. And today is an emergency. I came down, I don't know what I did. I had like 3 pairs of glasses, and they're all gone. So I don't know what I did. Can't blame this one on anybody else but this guy. So the first thing I want to talk about, there's a few things I want to hit. I want to. Oh, I got so much paper. I want to hit a few areas. Oh, mamma mia! Here we go. Just want to get a pad of paper, and I want you to get a pad of paper out too. Okay. But you don't need a paper if you have an iPad, and I do have an iPad, but I am going to write this down. First, we're going to talk definitions. And I want to understand what a surge protective device is, some of the ratings, things of that nature, and some of the other types of surge devices that we might use. There's a few different terms I want to look at. Second, I want to talk a little bit about the history and the migration of surge throughout the code. Third, and if you haven't figured it out, I'm making it up as we go. So remember, I don't speak on behalf of NFPA, IAEI, Eaton, NEMA, anybody other than this guy. What comes out of here started up here, and it's all from the heart. So I'm doing the best I can to try to help share information. But more importantly, this is a forum. You should be utilizing the chat. Please leverage the chat box down below. Put your comments in if you disagree with me. This is recorded. I can't speak to it. So please read the chats down below. I will try to respond, and maybe next time I go live, we'll continue the discussion if there's a good number of debates. So please share your information with everybody else who's watching this. So we're going to talk about definitions. We're going to talk about the history and the migration. I want to talk about where it's required. And I will hit the 2023 code, although I will touch on previous editions of the NEC as well. And I do want to address a question, and this will be my address the question. And the question that came into me was around real world application in a I don't want to say dwelling unit. It could be a dwelling unit. So let's say I'm going to take a dwelling unit, but it's a multifamily. So we'll talk like an apartment building. Let's talk about that. Let's talk about an apartment building with, say, I don't know, 200 rooms. Now, the difference here is a scenario that, again, you know, in your mind and in my mind and in anybody who's watching this, when I think of a multifamily dwelling unit, I picture a certain circuit arrangement, which may or may not align with exactly your picture of a circuit arrangement, your picture in your mind for this large 400 dwelling unit application might be a little bit different than what's in my mind. So this is going to be an interesting discussion, but I want to make sure that we look at the requirements, read the words, and apply them. All right, so first things first. Article 100. Let's talk definition. Now, if you think about, if you go to the numerous definitions and terms that are defined, you'll see surge arrestor, surge protective device, and those are the two surges. I thought there was three. I don't know why. It's suspended ceiling and support areas. So let's talk surge arrestor first. What's a surge arrestor? A surge arrestor is not a surge protective device. How do we know that? Because we have two different definitions. Duh, right? A surge arrestor is a protective device for limiting surge voltages by discharging or bypassing surge current. It also prevents continued flow of follow current while remaining capable of repeating these functions. That is a surge arrestor. A surge protective device comes in four different types. And these four different types are a protective devices that limit transient voltages. So we know it's a voltage device. It's not a current device. By diverting or limiting surge current. Now let's just take that first sentence. A protective device for limiting transient voltages by diverting or limiting surge current. Let's take the first sentence of surge arrestor. A protective device for limiting surge voltages. That says surge voltages, and an SPD says transient voltages. And the surge arrestor says by discharging or bypassing surge current. And a SPD says by diverting or limiting surge current. And they both say it also prevents continued flow of follow current while remaining capable of repeating these functions. And an SPD says they have, it adds the 4 different types: type 1, type 2, 3, and 4. Type 1 is on the line side of the service, disconnect. A type 2 is on the load side of the service disconnect. You can put a type 1 on the load side of the service disconnect, but you can't put a type 2 on the line side of the service disconnect. Type 3 is at your point of utilization, and then you have type 4, which is your components that are in assemblies, and we would see those in like industrial control panels and things like that. So you have 4 different types of surge protective devices, but there's only one surge arrestor. Now let's do this. Let's search all of NFPA 70 for surge arrestor. And it's an ER, not an OR. So we find it in 242, obviously, because 242 is for surge protective devices. So Article 242, this is an interesting thing. Article 242 is titled what? Overvoltage protection. And there are 2 types of overvoltage protective devices. One is a surge protective device, and the other is a surge arrestor. So, and 242 tells us that a surge protective devices and surge arresters shall not be reconditioned. 242, other articles, this tells us all the different places where and this is a nice table. You have the references to other locations in the NEC, and I see, oh no, it's there in emergency systems. And it's by equipment, fire pumps, emergency systems, elevators, critical operation power systems, community antenna television, and CATV, industrial machinery, fire. So you have all the different locations where surge protection is required in table 242.3. That is a very convenient table. I don't know why I've never really looked at it that way. I created my own table and I did a search throughout the whole NEC, and it aligns with every one of these. So I could have just went to 242, but you know what I was doing? I was verifying 242.3 is what I was doing. It wasn't that I didn't know that it was there. It was that I was verifying it. Yeah, that's the ticket. Okay, so 242, we know, covers 2 types of overvoltage protection devices. One is an SPD, and 2 is a surge arrestor. And these are, in 242 is where you're going to find all of the different requirements associated with those 2 types of devices. Surge arrestors. Surge arresters is in part, where's it at? 3. It tells us where you're not permitted to use them. Where is it not permitted to use? A surge arrestor shall not be installed where the rating of the surge arrestor is less than the maximum continuous phase to ground voltage. Well, that's obvious. Surge arrestor ratings, the duty cycle shall not be less than 125%. They talk about impedance grounded systems. Where used at a point on a circuit, we have the location, routing of surge arrestor equipment grounding conductors. All right, surge arrestor. So what standard is a surge arrestor? UL standard for surge arrestor is a 1449 device for surge protective devices. That's the surge protective devices. SPD, guidelines for surge protective devices, 1449. Let's do this. Ooh. we're going to go to, we have the UL SCCL Standards Certification Customer Library. We're going to go to 1449 Standard for Surge Protective Devices, and we're going to download it. And what we are going to do is we're going to do a quick search in the 1449 standard for surge arrestor. Control F, surge arrestor. Okay, surge protective device. So there's a definition for a surge protective device, an SPD, in the standard. A device composed of at least one nonlinear component. This is different than what's in the NEC. A device composed of at least one nonlinear component and intended for limited surge voltages on equipment by diverting or limiting surge current and is capable of repeating these functions as specified. SPDs were previously known as transient voltage surge suppressors or secondary surge arresters. Secondary surge arresters. Interesting. And that's the only reference. So 1449 does not cover a surge arrestor. And that is not the end of the story. All right, surge arrestor. What is a surge arrestor listed to? 1449, surge arrestor. 1449 does not cover surge arresters. Surge arrestor. All right, here we go. Surge protective devices. Here we go. NEMA has a FAQ. I'm going to put the FAQ in a link down below. I'm going to do this. Control C. I'm going to create a little notepad. And we're going to do new note and link. So NEMA surge.org/FAQS. What is the difference between the terms surge arrestor, transient voltage surge suppressor, and now surge protective devices? It says up until the third edition of 1449, that's the UL standard, and put into effect in 2009, were various terms used when referencing devices intended to limit the effects of transient surge events. Surge arresters less than 1,000 volts, commonly referred to as secondary surge arresters, were originally developed for and applied to the line side of the power distribution system to protect utility supplied equipment and building wire. Surge arresters were intended to protect the system structure and not necessarily the connected equipment and loads. And then you had transient voltage surge suppressor. That was for a microprocessor type of equipment. And then in the with the adoption of UL 1449, the third edition, both the terms secondary surge arrestor and TVSS were done away with. And that's when we adopted the surge protective device. So that doesn't quite help me. Let's go back and see where is the term surge arrestor used in the code. So we know it's in 235, 242, 235.409. Surge arresters installed in accordance with the requirements in Part 2 and 3 of Article 242 shall be permitted on each ungrounded overhead service conductor. So surge arresters are for the line side of the service overcurrent protective device. It's on the utility side. Let's go back. That's in 235.409. I'm in the 2023 code book. There is in, I'm not going to go to 242 because we know all about 242. We know it can, 230 permits us to put it on the utility side. there's a surge arrestor. And now in 502, it tells us surge arresters and surge protective devices installed in class 2 div 1 locations, they have to be in suitable enclosures. So that doesn't help us. I'm staying out of 242 because we went through 242. 501, class 1, surge arresters and surge protective devices shall be non-arcing. So this is in class 1 div 2. So in 501.35b, there are some additional requirements. And here we go. There's only two other places in Article 230. 230.94, relative location of overcurrent device and other service equipment. So this is, did I get that right? 230.94. I said 230.94? Yes. Relative location. So this is the overcurrent device shall be protected. So this tells us in an exception, I believe it's exception number 2, high impedance shunt circuits, surge arresters, type 1, surge protective devices, surge protective capacitors, and instrument transformers shall be permitted to be connected and installed on the supply side of the service disconnecting means as permitted by 230.82. So that's just telling you the relative location of the overcurrent protective device in regard to that other equipment, which in this case, we're talking about the surge arresters, type 1 surge protective devices, etc., etc. So, and then the other location was 230.82. Equipment connected to the supply side. So, sounds like a surge arrestor, very similar to a surge protective device. But a surge arrestor is something you would see on the utility side. Can't find the UL standard for it. If you know what the UL standard is for a surge arrestor, because it's not 1449, because we just looked at 1449. 1449 said, and I know Michael Hofkin is watching, and he is feverishly, in 1449, there's only one reference related to surge arrestor, and it's found in the definition in section 3.48 of a surge protective device, but it doesn't say surge arrestor, it says secondary surge arrestor. And it says that the SPD basically replaced TVSS, transient voltage surge suppression, and secondary surge arresters. So the word secondary is interesting. So, but that's the only reference in 1449. And if we look at the scope of 1449, it just says surge protective devices designed for repeated limiting of transient voltage surges as specified to the standard, not exceeding 1,000 volts. Okay, let's go back. Let's do this. Surge arrestor rating. In 242, surge arrestor rating, the duty cycle rating of a surge arrestor shall not be less than 125% of the maximum continuous operating voltage available at the point of application. For solidly grounded systems, the maximum continuous operating voltage shall be the phase to ground voltage of the system. And it says for impedance or ungrounded systems, the maximum continuous operating voltage shall be the phase to phase voltage of the system. There's an informational note. Here we go. IEEE C62.11. Standard for metal oxide surge arresters for alternating current power circuits greater than 1 kV. Ta-da! And finally, we took the journey through the code, trying to figure out what is a surge arrestor. I took you through all of that because that's typically where we'll go. exactly that way. And then we finally get to surge arrestor rating, and we find out that it's an IEEE document, C62.11-2020, standard for metal oxide surge arresters for alternating current power circuits greater than 1 kV. And then also IEEE C62.22, guide for the application of metal oxide surge arresters for alternating current systems, for further information on surge arresters. So those two IEEE documents are available, and you'll find that in the informational note number 1 of section 242.42. So now you might understand why Article 242 is not called surge protective devices, because it's not just about surge protective devices. It covers surge protective devices and surge arresters. And no, they are not identical. All right? Identical. They're not identical. So, informational note number 1, very valuable. It's an IEEE document. It's not a UL standard. UL 1449 covers surge protective devices, and there was a term in there, secondary surge arrestor, because surge arresters are on the utility side, on not the utility side, on the medium voltage side. So when you look at Article 242, one would argue that I don't know if 235, let's look at 235. 235 is your medium voltage. Remember, in the 2023 code, 235 combined branch circuits, feeders, and services for over 1,000 volts. So let's do a search. 235 surge arrestor is found in 235.409. So this is your medium voltage. We read this earlier. That's a medium voltage application, 235. That covers your surge arrestor requirements, and it points you to 242 parts 2 and 3. So that's the only reference in Article 235. And that's in what part? 235.409 is probably on services. Yes, on part 5, services. So you won't find a surge arrestor on the load side of service over current protective devices downstream towards the load. You're going to find a surge arrestor in the medium voltage applications of surge. I like that discussion. I don't know about you, but I just had like an aha moment. So I understand why 242 is called over voltage protection, because you can't call it surge protection because it also covers surge arresters. Can't call it surge protection devices because it covers surge arresters and the like. All right. So what a journey that was. So now we know a little bit more about the definition. We also started to get into a little bit of the history. I will say that the 2008 edition of the code, and remember what we read earlier about 1449. 1449, that didn't come up. All right. I'm going to get right back to you. I got to fix something. I'll be right back. There we go. All right. See that? That was easy. So this is what I wanted. NEC 2008. Remember what we said about the about the UL Standard 1449 third edition, I believe it was. It was the third edition that changed the changed the way we don't call them TVSS anymore. It's now SPD. So that's the first thing. So be mindful of that. So 2008 is when we had the Article 285 title change. We had a definition, and the ROP, report on proposals. How many of you remember the report on proposals, and then the report on comments, ROPs and ROCs? That's going back. It's going back in time. They said that this is one of several related proposals affecting Articles 100, 230, 250, 280, 285, 501, and 502. And it was all based upon, again, the changing of how we reference the surge for transient voltage surge suppression and something, and what was the other one? Secondary surge arrestor. Right, in the 14 code, it was the, when I look back at some of the history, 708 had surge in it. Remember 708 is critical operation power systems. That introduced surge protection, but it was part of the overall. And they said anything that was in an Article 708 system had to have surge protection. And how I know, and there was no, in the substantiation, whenever they created that article, it was a whole new article. They didn't substantiate every single requirement. So there wasn't a specific item that justified requiring surge protection on all of the 708 equipment, Article 708 equipment. So what, when in the 14 code, because I remember this because when I was looking at the public inputs to Article 700, and I was helping a team put together the public inputs for that, we were trying to come up with a substantiation. We knew we had loss. We couldn't get statistics from insurance companies and things like that because they wouldn't share the information. We also made public inputs to the group that I was related to there. Also tried for residential dwelling units as well. And we had a very large insurance company and a few others that were part of a group, and the insurance company said, look, we pay out a lot, and then there's the deductibles that a lot of equipment gets lost and it's never hit. And remember in this discussion, Article 90, what is the purpose of the NEC? I think a lot of people make a mistake. And the mistake they make is they say that the requirements in the code only pertain to safety requirements. And if you look in Article 90.2, use and application, 90.2a is practical safeguarding. And it tells you what the purpose of the code is. The purpose of the code is the practical safeguarding of persons and property from hazards arising from the use of electricity. So I have to protect persons and I should be protecting property. So if I can demonstrate a significant amount of loss due to electricity, the NEC covers that. I don't have to kill somebody. That's a fallacy. I don't have to kill someone to have a requirement in the NEC. I'm limiting damage to equipment as well. So when this went into Article 700 in the 2014 code, that I explicitly remember trying to figure out how do we address the substantiation with when we're hampered by the data that we're using. So what we did was we did some homework, and we found we did find some data. The what was it? The Research Foundation. Let's just take a look at NFPA Research Foundation. NFPA Research Foundation. I'm just going to take, don't allow, Fire Protection Research Foundation has some data. And you know what? I wonder if I can do this on the fly. I guess not. Let's do it here. Whoa. All right. So if I go to NFPA Research Foundation, you'll see where it says Fire Protection Research Foundation. So there's a lot of information that you'll find on this website if you're not aware of it. They have, if you click on this, they have about the foundation, current projects, campaign for fire services, analysis of public safety, call answering event, firefighting foams, refrigerants. So they cover, remember, it's not just electrical. NFPA is not just about electrical. PPE and fire service, wood protections, enhanced incident commander, etc. Here are some research reports they have available. There's a topic called electrical right there. Now, if you look at, you have electric shock drowning. They've got healthcare facilities in 2022. Surge protective devices. This was 2014. Data assessment for electrical surge protective devices. So NEC 2014. So when you look at the research that was going on, data assessment for surge protective devices, NFPA Research Foundation. So what we did was we asked the Research Foundation for do some homework, basically. And that information was leveraged for including surge protection in your Article 700 systems. And then in the 2020 edition, we added the new article for Article 242, focused article setting the stage for future work, etc. So we already talked a little bit about some of the requirements there. They expanded 23067. They put a requirement into residential dwelling units. Now, the information that was available for this, we leveraged some of the homework from the 2014 research. We also leveraged other data that was available at the time. The internet is a beautiful thing. When you can find a lot of research and data for that one. So, and you know how to go and find some of the reasons. So this was the 2020 code, right? So if you're interested on the public inputs, then you go to www.nfpa.org/70. We teach you how to swim or fish here. And you go to the 2020 edition, you select, and then you can go to the first draft and second draft, and you can see the requirements on what was added and why it was added. It needs facial recognition. So they call this Terra, and you can come over here to the chapter, and you can come to Article 230, and I believe we should 230.67. So if you go to 230.67, you can see the new requirements, but more importantly, you can go to the first revision. And you can see there were two public inputs. And it says this revision is intended to address the recognized need for surge protection to protect the sensitive electronics and systems, most modern appliances, etc. Additionally, the expanded use of distributed energy resources within electrical systems often results in a more opportunity or greater exposure for the introduction of surges into the system. So there were two public inputs. The first one came from Chad Kennedy and Schneider. The original aligns with the recognized for surge, blah, blah, blah. And go back to the first revision. Let's look at the second public input. This one came in from James Dollard, Local 98, IBW, surge protected device, all surge device type 1, type 2. And looks like Mr. Dollard gave studies and examples, etc. So that was that's sort of the history and how you can find some of the information around surge. So we had it for dwelling units. All right, so let's take a look at what does the requirement say. Let's look at this. Now, I want to go to 230, and I want to read the current edition of the NEC requirements for surge in Article 230. And that would be 230.67. Now, we added, 230.67 was added in the 2020 code, and all we did in the 2023 was we expanded to dormitory units, guest rooms and guest suites of hotels and motels, and areas of nursing homes. So this was service equipment. So if you think about service equipment in a dwelling unit, let's just do this. You come down, and this is your panel board, right? Let's just do this. So this is service equipment. The requirement in the 2020 code and in the 2023 code for 230.67, it says all services supplying the following occupancies. Now in the 2020 code, it said supplying dwelling units shall be provided with a surge protective device. So if this is, say this is the utility. I don't know why I'm working in a vacuum here. This is utility. So this is service equipment, services supplying a dwelling unit. If this is a dwelling unit, we'll call this a dwelling unit service. Then I would have to put an SPD in this box. Right? So you can accomplish that various ways. You could put a breaker in the box. You could build it buy a panel board that has it built onto the bus. You can buy a surge, connect it through a breaker, put it on the outside. You can have a surge protective device that doubles as a circuit breaker as well. It does two jobs, and plug that right onto the bus. Or you can buy a surge protective device that plugs right onto the bus. So now we had surge requirements for every service, and then in the 2023 cycle, they expanded to dormitory units, guest rooms and guest suites of hotels and motels, and then areas of nursing homes and limited care facilities used exclusively as patient sleeping rooms. Now, the other thing that we did was we said, what happens? I'm just going to draw this. I'm bad at drawing. Let's say this is the road. Okay, and let's say that this is the dwelling. Now, this was the discussion. We said, what happens if I have service equipment out here at the road, and then I supply a panel that's not, this is not service equipment. Okay, that is not service equipment. This is your service equipment. And so the discussions at Code Panel 10 and the public inputs that we saw said, what happens in this type of application? What happens when I have a service out at the road? The SPD would be required here. But where do I really want it? I want it there. I want my SPD down at the house, not out there at the road. I can have a lot of transients introduced to this dwelling unit, and that SPD out there at the road is not doing any good. So what did we do? We went into 225. We said, you know what? We need to make a change in 225. Where is it at? 225.42. So 225.42 said, now remember, what is 225? Outdoor, outside feeders and branch circuits. 225.42 says, where a feeder supplies any of the following, a surge protective device shall be installed. Where a feeder supplies a dwelling units, where a feeder supplies dormitory units, guest rooms and guest suites, etc., the same 4 locations. So this is an outside feeder supplying a dwelling unit. So now it meets 225.42. And it says that the SPD shall be installed in or adjacent to the distribution equipment that is connected to the load side of the feeder. So this is the distribution equipment. Let me get a red. Oh, you know what? I'm going to do a highlighter. I'm going to do yellow highlighter. So this is my distribution equipment at the end of the feeder. That's where they want the surge. And they want it to be a type 1 or a type 2. And if you replace that equipment, then you need to put it in, make sure you put surge in there. And it has to be rated with a nominal discharge current of not less than 10,000 amps. So that now, we didn't stop there though. What we did is we went into 215 as well. And we said, hey, if it's good for the goose, it should be good for the gander. And then we put it in 215.18. And honestly, if it's in 215.18, 215, Article 215 deals with feeders. I don't care where the feeder is installed. The feeder could be installed outdoors or indoors. It needs to meet the requirements in 215. If there's something special that just applies to outdoor feeders, then you would find it in 225. Outside branch circuits and feeders. And honestly, now, different topic. So in any case, you know where my head was going. What do I need 225 for? Why didn't I make just a part in 215 that said outside feeders, and then made a part in 210 outside branch circuits if there's anything special for outside branch circuits and feeders? But in any case, different day, different public input. So the outside feeder 225, we put the same language in 215. We don't really need the requirements in 225.42 because it's in 215.18 for feeders, any feeder, indoor or outdoor. And it has the same language. Where a feeder supplies any of the following, a surge protective device shall be installed. when it supplies a dwelling units, dormitory units, the same 4 locations. And it says for location, the SPD shall be installed in or adjacent to the distribution equipment connected to the load side of the feeder. Now, so what I want to do is I want to show you a question that I got with regard to a multi-dwelling unit. So I had a a few customers, and people are trying to understand the code, trying to make sure that they are meeting the requirements of the NEC and understanding the requirements of the NEC. And they had this discussion. So whenever we talked about feeders, we sort of talked about when the service was out there at the road. That was an example. And we said, what happens if I have a feeder that feeds, that's say on a house feeding another one of these, I don't know, maybe another dwelling unit or something. Because remember, what do you need to meet from a dwelling unit perspective? Okay, so a dwelling unit is defined as, right, a dormitory unit too, but a dwelling unit is a defined term, and it says that it's a single unit providing complete and independent living facilities for one or more persons, including permanent provisions for living, sleeping, cooking, and sanitation. So the thought process was, if I have a feeder that's, say, already feeding, let's say I have a panel that's feeding a dwelling unit, and I take a feeder and I feed another dwelling unit from that panel. That separate dwelling unit needs to have a surge protective device. So that was sort of the discussion. So, and what did we typically see? We would have something like this. All right, let me show you this. So this would be a good example. You ready? Oh. So you could have service equipment that was, say, a meter stack or a meter center on a building, and each of those meter breakers feeds a dwelling unit panel board. So this was sort of the discussion that we had at panel 10, where we had a meter center supplying dwelling units. And it was the each of these. So if you think about the requirements in the NEC, this is service equipment, right? You would need to have an SPD at this location. But if I had an SPD at each of the downstream, so if I go to 230, where's 230? 230. All right, so 230.67. There is an exception in 23067 that says, are you ready for this? The SPD shall not be required to be located at the service equipment as required in 23067B if located at each next level distribution equipment downstream toward the load. So this is each next level distribution equipment. That's the next level distribution equipment. If you have it at each of those locations, then you don't need the SPD at the meter center. Now, the situation that we ran to in West by God, Virginia was this. I'm going to grow this a little bit. I'm going to move this over here. And then I'm going to copy this. I'm going to duplicate it. And I am going to take this and I'm going to come out here and I'm going to call this HVAC. Now, in that case, I have to have an SPD located at this location to meet the exception, which says the SPD shall not be required to be located at the service equipment if located at each next level distribution equipment downstream toward the load. So if you consider the HVAC equipment a load, then you wouldn't need to put surge protective device there. But if you had I believe what we had was a disconnect right here. Next to the HVAC equipment, you would need to have surge. You would need to have an SPD in there to meet that exception. If there was no disconnect on that HVAC equipment and it was just a load and that was a branch circuit, then I would say you don't have distribution equipment. You are at the next downstream because the service feeds the HVAC directly. But if you go to a different disconnect and then go to the HVAC, that disconnect would have to have a surge protective device. And that was the situation we ran into. So we had to put a surge protective device in the service equipment. And then we also had it down here, unless we put surge over there, which we weren't going to do. So the surge protective device had to go at the service entrance equipment and at each of those next level distributions, which was down there at the dwelling units. So that's one application. That's a real world application. There was another one, which was a little bit more complicated. And this one, how do I move this? There we go. This one, make this a little smaller. All right, so now, here's what I've got. I have service equipment up the top. So let's make this in blue. So let's do this. Where's my highlighter? There. Oh, here we go. Here's my highlighter. So this is service equipment, right? Let me make that bigger. There we go. Service equipment up there at the top. This is it's a meter center. So it's distribution equipment serving dwelling units. And we have, in this case, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Now, in the example that we had, I had this duplicate. So I had multiple meter centers feeding dwelling units. And I think there were like 400 and some dwelling units. And then off of the service equipment, you have this, you have a few panels that served common areas like hallways and outside lighting, maybe the laundry, any of the common areas, both from lighting and from equipment perspective. So you have your service equipment feeding multiple meter centers, feeding all of these dwelling units. And now I have to apply 215, Article 215 and 230. So let's talk about 230 first. 230 says service equipment has to have an SPD, and lo and behold, I've got an SPD there. And it says I do not need an SPD there if I have it at each next level distribution equipment downstream towards the load. Well, I have it at each of these meter centers. Every meter center has an SPD, except these two panels over here. Those two panels, lighting, common areas, and mechanical, do not have an SPD. No SPD. Well, then I can't meet the exception unless I put an SPD at those panels. If I put SPD there, then I would not need it in the service equipment. Hopefully it's sinking in. So if I don't have it in each of those lighting, then I need it at the service. If I do have it there and all of those meter centers, then I do not need it at the service equipment. So that's 230. Now let's look at 215. 215 tells us in 215.18 that a feeder that supplies any of the following, and if these are all dwelling units, so that means that feeder supplies a dwelling unit. Dwelling units. It supplies dwelling units. It supplies 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 dwelling units. So the feeder that leaves the service equipment feeds equipment that supplies 6 dwelling units. So that feeder, you would need an SPD at the meter center to meet 215.18. And it just so happens that this feeder feeds a dwelling unit. And you would need an SPD at the equipment connected to the load side of that feeder, which is right there. So for this type of an application, you can get away with not putting it at the service if every one of those meter centers, that next level distribution downstream towards the load, if each of those meter centers have surge, and don't forget these L1 and L2s, if it comes off the service, everything at the next level distribution equipment down from the service, whatever that service is feeding, each of those distribution pieces of equipment have to have a surge protective device to leverage the exception in 230. If you don't have it in L1, and in fact there were multiple panels, it wasn't just an L1 and M1, there were multiple panels. They elected not to put them at those because there was no requirement, because this equipment fed common areas. It did not feed a dwelling unit. So there was no requirement in the code to require surge protection at those panels. So instead of putting surge protection at those panels, they put it in the service equipment. And then all of the meter centers have to have a surge protective device because of 215.18, and each of the dwelling units have to have a surge protective device because of 215.18. Now, the gray area was if in the dwelling unit I fed another panel. So it's very similar to this house here. So you have a residential panel. And the panel board in my dwelling unit here goes upstairs to a panel board upstairs that feeds the circuits on the second floor. The question is, would I need to put an SPD on the second floor? And I've gotten multiple answers from different people. Some people say yes, because of 215.18, that panel board serves the dwelling unit. Now, it doesn't serve the entire dwelling unit, it serves the second floor of a dwelling unit, but it would need an SPD. I have also talked to others who say, no, the code's very clear, where a feeder supplies a dwelling unit. And that feeder does not supply a dwelling unit. It supplies a panel board inside of a home that supplies a portion of the dwelling unit. And oh, by the way, somebody else pointed out, I could come down to an AC disconnect and then go to HVAC. No SPD would be required there. Although it's a feeder going to a disconnect. And what's the difference between a disconnect and a panel board? If there's a fuse in here, right? So if there's a fuse in there, because it says that contains branch circuit overcurrent protective devices. So if I have an AC disconnect with a fusible AC disconnect going to HVAC equipment, then I would say, oh, you need to put a surge device there. That wouldn't quite be realistic, because it's not the overcurrent protective device that dictates whether or not you're going to have surge events. The goal of, and this is my opinion, the goal of 215 was to hit a feeder that supplies a dwelling unit or a dormitory unit, etc. And that panel board, if it serves the entire dwelling unit, then it would be covered, but it doesn't cover the entire dwelling unit. This is where the gray area is. If you can feel me on that one, I think we might need some clarity in 215.18. So we went through definitions. We talked a little bit about the history. We talked about where it's required in the 2023 code, and we got to address and discuss the applications from a real world perspective, what we're seeing out there and where there may be some confusion. I hope that you are firing up the chat box if you have comments and questions about it. If you have questions from me, obviously this is a recorded session, so I'm going to have to comment later. But I value your opinion. Please share your knowledge, share your opinion. Let us know what you're thinking. How would you handle these types of scenarios? How would you handle implementing 215.18 and 225 and 230 around surge protection? Love to know. So we went through a lot of good information. I hit all the items that I wanted to. I'm a little over an hour, and I hope you enjoyed the session. I apologize for not being able to go live. I really enjoyed the last 2 weeks. We had great discussions online. If you have not had a chance to check out kitchens and check out garages from the previous 2 editions of IAEI News Live, please do so. I enjoyed those 2 sessions. So for now, thank you for joining. Thanks for the discussions. Thanks for chatting it up. I appreciate what you do for the electrical industry and what you do for electrical safety. Don't forget your IAEI membership. Subscribe to the YouTube channel. Hit the thumbs up. And if you have to hit the thumbs down, hit it twice. That's the way it works. We will see you next week right here on IAEI News Live. This is Thomas Dimitrovich signing off. Take care, stay safe, and please stay healthy.